Welcome back into the Percussive Art Society Georgia Chapter interview series. My name is Andrew Bennett, and over the next few months, we're getting to know some of the great percussionists in the state of Georgia, from collegiate professors to independent performers and educators. Before we dive in, I do want to take a moment to remind you that if you're not an active PAS member, please consider signing up or reactivating your membership. So without any further ado, I want to go ahead and introduce a very special guest today. He was the former principal percussionist of the Atlanta Symphony Orchestra, as well as the associate professor, director of percussion at Georgia State University, Mr. Jack Bell. How are you today, sir?
I'm fine, Andrew, and thanking you at this moment for allowing me to participate in this presentation.
Absolutely.
So you've given us some questions to answer, and your first question had to do with an insight as to the journey we've had as a percussionist, how we started, when did I know that I wanted to do this professionally, and other questions that would spring off of that initial question you submitted. I'm going to go back to something you might not expect, because it was a little unusual as I've thought about it over a period of time. I was born October 16th, 1944. October, right? In December of 1944, my first teacher was working in the Army, and he was setting out spots on the ground for the Army soldiers to fire their weapons at to increase the accuracy of their shooting. But it was also a period that the Battle of the Bulge was taking place, that famous battle that we hear about all of our life. My first teacher's name was Harold Firestone. He was really quite famous at that time. But I have to go back and finish this first story, as you'll find out as I move forward. In that Battle of the Bulge, he had placed a small wooden box inside his uniform. Inside that box was a record that was given to him by one of his younger students at that moment. The record contained inside the box was a performance of something that his student named Betty Langley wanted him to hear, but of course he couldn't hear it. So he'd placed the record in the box and he'd placed it against his chest. In the Battle of the Bulge, Harold was hit by shrapnel, and the shrapnel shattered the box and it shattered the record, but it saved his life. There were hundreds of us that studied with Harold Firestone over a period of many more years. And if it weren't for that moment, that single moment in history, I wouldn't be here. I wouldn't be who I am. Because Harold was my teacher from 6th grade until 10th grade. He taught me on snare drum, he taught timpani, mallets, all the instruments that I could have learned in my early preparatory years. But in 10th grade, something very tragic happened. He died of a sudden heart attack. And two people were able to make it to the top of the stairs where he had had the heart attack. One was his adopted sister, Aline Trafford. The other was myself. I was only in 10th grade. But when we found him, even though his sister, of course, let out a very enormous scream, I saw him looking at me on the floor with his eyes open, all tangled up in coat hangers that he had grabbed for on a rack, having his heart attack. But with his eyes wide open looking at me, it penetrated me so deeply that for my entire teaching career, even until now, which is way more than 50 years now, I don't know any other way to say it because I've said it over and over, I became Firestone. I have taught and thought like Firestone my entire career, from what I learned from him from 6th grade until 10th grade. And believe it or not, his techniques were so profound that I've been able to teach those techniques to college majors and professionals. And I've developed those techniques, of course, over the span of my 50-year teaching career. So I'd have to say that that's the first part of my lifelong career. I didn't know that I was going to become a professional percussionist. I only knew that I was studying with Harold Firestone and taking in that enormous experience. When I reached my early years, about fifth grade, I was in Elkhart, Indiana. And I don't know if that rings sort of a bell with you, but Elkhart, Indiana was considered to be the music instrument capital of the world. That was a, quote, term that had been connected to that city because Kahn and Selmer and Bundy and all the other major manufacturers of instruments were located in that city of about 40,000. What that meant is that the Elkhart High School Band and Orchestra, by the way, which is huge, was conducted by a man named John Davies. But the Elkhart Municipal Band, which was made up of these professionals, so to speak, that were part of these major music factories, put on concerts in the summer. And they were great. The only difference, you know, between a professional and amateur is just the amount of pay that they might receive. So these were, quote, amateurs, but they played like any professional group that you'd ever hear. I was only in 5th grade, but I had the chance to go back behind the bandstand and watch the percussionists perform. So who do you think might have been playing snare drum behind the Elkhart Municipal Band's bandstand? Betty Langley. That same person that had sent Firestone that record that he'd preserved in that small metal box, small wooden box, that had saved his life. Well, time progressed a little while, and I reached 10th grade, having my wonderful lessons from Harold, having all the other experiences that I could have in this great city. And I had developed enough snare drum technique that by the time I had reached 10th grade, the members of the Elkhart Municipal Band chose me to be able to become the youngest member for that band. And the privilege I had was to be able to stand next to Betty Langley and play snare drum. Now, you would think something like that might have just happened, but it didn't happen at all. I was so bewildered when I stood next to her because it was like watching a fire blazing that I couldn't even get my sticks held on the drum to keep up with the music that was going by so fast. And the band didn't have any time to teach me. All I could do was go at the rehearsals and observe her playing and maybe just play a particular piece that didn't require that kind of circus drumming technique that was being performed. It took me about a year until I began to catch on to it enough to keep up with her. But by my senior year, we were like a pair, and we were blazing out every piece of music that came up, and I had absorbed all those fantastic techniques. So that was another way that I was able to grow most unexpectedly as a snare drum performer. When I reached my senior year in high school, there was a woman named Paula Culp, and she was studying at the Oberlin College Conservatory of Music with Cloyd Duff, the timpanist with the Cleveland Orchestra, internationally famous teacher. Well, she was giving me timpani lessons in the summer of my senior year. And my mind is starting to tell all the reasons I made it into Oberlin, but I'm embarrassed to tell how I made it in, so I'm just not going to say all that. But I did make it into the Oberlin College. That'll come up in my autobiography, you can be assured. I'm working on that now. So I took timpani lessons from Paula, and I made it into Oberlin. After Paula graduated from Oberlin a few years later, she became the timpanist and first percussionist with the Minneapolis, Minnesota Orchestra. I was in good company, right? So I did my study with Cloyd Duff. You'll never have another experience like this in your life. How was I to know at 19 years old that I was going to be studying with the most major timpanist in the world, learning percussion techniques and mallet techniques and the kind of timpani performing musically and technically that would give me an insight to be able to teach and perform the rest of my career. I was able to study with Cloyd for 5.5 years. I completed my music education degree at Oberlin, and then I stayed a 5th year to work on my performance degree. I even was fortunate enough to be able to study with him at Aspen, Colorado, for one of the summer programs, and that was a really huge opportunity. So I had 5.5 years. When I graduated from college, we're moving to the start of the professional career now, possibilities. There were 3 opportunities at the end of the 5.5 years at Oberlin. One was a second-round audition for the marimba soloist with the Marine Band in Washington. I had sent in all my tapes and applications, and that was the invite back. Charles Owens, if you remember, had that position for 20 years, I think. It was something, I can't remember exactly, but if you don't know, there's a really great recording of him, a CD, performing with the Marine Band in Washington. You might have to do a little research, but I've got a copy of it here in the studio, and it's just so enjoyable to hear that kind of perfection being performed. So that's an insight, possibly. The second one was to have the chance to go and study at graduate study at Indiana University with George Gaber, the famous cigar-smoking George Gaber. It turned out some of the best students in the country. The third one, because I had submitted everything that was asked for, was the chance to become principal percussionist with the Atlanta Symphony. And that also meant assistant timpanist. The Atlanta Symphony had its eye on a new timpani player, but they also had a principal percussion position open. So I was going for the principal percussion position first. I was, like so many people my age, in the middle of the Vietnam War. I don't know if you connect it, but that was in the period of 1967, 1966, 1967, 1968. We were all living in that very, very difficult time. So the only way I might be able to have the opportunity of the symphony was for the higher authorities of the symphony and the school systems in the area, especially the supervisors of music, to work together. And I was secured a teaching position as the new band director at Columbia High School. That band director's job also carried along with it a choral director position. So I had to become the new band director and the new choral director in 1967 at Columbia High School, while I was also the new principal percussionist, assistant timpanist for the Atlanta Symphony. There was a particular classification for educational that bought you a little time. That, by the way, was before that national draft came about, and that was a lottery. So if you weren't at the proper number in the lottery, it would not have mattered what you did career-wise. You could have been taken to Vietnam or part of the armed services. So when I was teaching my jobs at Columbia High School and working with the symphony, I would have to go out on the marching field with the band, and we could only rehearse at 6:30 in the morning. It was the only time of the entire day left. Fortunately, the parents were supporting me so well, and the band members and I we got along really well. You've got this 23-year-old guy there that's just out of college, and you've got 10th, 11th, and 12th graders. What's the difference in age? I mean, when you see them, you hardly know it, and some of them are so mature. We just we just bonded together. It was great. So I had those rehearsals at 6:30 in the morning. I started classes at about 8 o'clock. I finished classes at the high school at 3:30. The symphony rehearsal started at 4 p.m. Now, I was out on Columbia Drive for Columbia High School, and I had to make it all the way around that part of 20, and then I had to go up all the way up 85 to get to 10th Street for the old Clark Howell High School. That's where we actually started rehearsing. That's where the orchestra started when they were making the transition from starting to become under Robert Shaw, a more full-time orchestra. So over that first period of time, I was doing okay at the high school because that's a fairly confined, protected environment when you're in your classroom. But with the symphony, as an example, one of the first things that happened with the orchestra was a run out to Athens, Georgia. And the first piece of music that was billed for that concert was American in Paris. American in Paris is considered to be one of the major excerpts, along with Porgy and Bess and any of the others that you want to name. And it just so happens that Porgy and Bess and American in Paris were two that Mr. Duff and I had not worked on. I don't know why we'd worked on a little bit of the excerpt, but I had never seen or heard of American in Paris. So here I am in Athens, Georgia, 23-year-old, playing American in Paris for the first time, and the orchestra knew it forward and backwards. I mean, I don't even have to tell you what happened. I was lost from the downbeat to the end of the piece. I guess I can't tell anyone out there that's had that kind of experience. You're sick. I was crying on the bus all the way back. I was sheltered in a back seat, not wanting to see any other orchestra member because I was so embarrassed of what I did not contribute. I don't think I could say much else about that. That's the starting point. That's the point in which you absolutely panic inside that you're going to lose your job at that very moment. It was most interesting to me that no one ever said anything to me about that. What I did, of course, is ran out and get recordings of American in Paris and Porgy and Bess, and I started playing along with those recordings every single chance I had to get ready for those possibilities. It was the biggest eye-opener I'd ever had, that I had to find out what excerpts I had never worked on, but not just the excerpts, because the excerpts aren't playing the piece in reality with the orchestra. I had to play with orchestras performing in the context of the music. Then I started being able to figure out with the music exactly how it was going to be performed. That's the only way that it can be done. That was a rough road, because at the university, I only had one percussion major, a broken down xylophone, a bass drum, and two kettle drums, and I'll say it that way, because the bowls of the drums were being used as receptacles for copy machine materials. Now, copy machines at that time were called A.B. Dick copiers, and you crank them out, and they have ink all over them. So these ink receptacle papers were just falling down in these timpani bowls. I looked at those when I was first at the university, but I was afraid to say anything. Little by little, as I felt more secure, I had them cleaned out, and we got some heads mounted on them. Sorry, I'll stop it immediately. The growth points you can see for me in both of these organizations were the start of a very long, rocky road. And I had to grow in both organizations over a period of years. So I hope you're okay seeing, and Andrew, please respond now. Are you okay seeing how it all started? Did you see what was going on?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Does that bring about any other kind of question or statement that needs to be made before I try to proceed?
Not yet. I'm just interested in hearing the rest of the story.
Okay, well, here comes the Paul Harvey rest of the story. Do my best. It does have some very interesting and somewhat comical moments here. The Atlanta Symphony was asked to perform the opening of the Civic Center in Atlanta. Huge, beautiful new building. My principal wanted me to play a PTA meeting for the high school and assemble the band. I had discussed with him that I had to play the opening of the Civic Center, and I'd be happy to play at the next PTA meeting. That was it. That was the end of the discussion. I played the opening of the Civic Center. It was a grand and glorious opening. I didn't know that my high school principal had assembled the band himself, waited until the PTA meeting had started, and then said, "Well," to the audience, "I guess Mr. Bell has made his decision." Crazy moment. I came into the high school the next morning. The teachers who knew me the best were standing out in the hall. One of them was crying. She was my flag lady, a wonderful math teacher, helped me so enormously. And she grabbed my arm as I was coming in the building, and she said, "Jack, it's just not fair. It's just not fair." I looked at her. I emotionally responded to her, but I had no idea what she was talking about. I got down to the music office, and I got down to the principal's office, and in my box there was just a note from the principal that said, "See me." So I went back to my office and I put things down, and then I went back to his office, and I found out that I'd been fired for not attending the PTA meeting with the full band. No explanations. Of course, I contacted my supervisor of music for the county, and nothing was changed. I was, of course, allowed to fill out the entire year. Now, there's a wonderful however at this moment. I had contacted Tom Brumby, who was the head of the music department at Georgia State University. And in our discussions over a period of time, he had matched my salary at the high school for the forthcoming year with a half-time contract to become the new percussion instructor at Georgia State University. So that was the instructor level first year. I had the contract. So I went to my wastepaper basket in my office. I unfolded a single sheet of paper, all crumpled up. I wrote on the paper, "This is my official resignation from Columbia High School." Had nothing to do with the school or the students. I was just mad at the principal. So he did that to me. I took it to his office. I handed it to him. He looked very upset when I gave it to him. I don't think he expected that kind of a reaction. And I just simply walked away. And from there on, all the powers that be had to deal with it. I had a wonderful year with the students. We bonded. We were like one. Had a fantastic concert at the end of the year. And from there, I started my career at Georgia State University. Little side story. I'd like to tell you something about what it was really like to be a principal percussionist with the Atlanta Symphony. People may not know. They may think if you're a principal percussionist with the Atlanta Symphony, you're performing. That's all you do. You perform. Well, you really don't perform more than maybe 1/3 of the time at the most. What I did was spend all my time off stage. I was working with the librarians because Mr. Shaw had asked for the music to be marked 6 weeks in advance. Now, the library couldn't even get the music in 6 weeks in advance, but he had asked me to have the music marked 6 weeks in advance. So I was putting all kinds of pressure on the librarians. The librarians were mad at me. I couldn't talk to Mr. Shaw. The librarians couldn't talk. We were just at a battle, but we had to get it done as far, and they'd say, "Well, 4 weeks ahead is all we can possibly provide you with." So I went with the 4 weeks ahead, and things just kind of settled down to that. Equipment. Anytime the orchestra needed extra equipment, we didn't own a lot of equipment at that time. So when we were doing Berlioz' Symphonie Fantastique, we had to have huge church bells for that low C and G. We started out renting extremely low chimes. Sometimes they weren't good enough. We ordered huge bell plates, large rectangle bell plates that were tuned to the notes C and G, but the pitch centers weren't accurate enough. So there were just feuds that went on when the conductor heard that for the first time, and it was a simple, "This will not do, send these back." playing the right instruments. We found the Dallas Symphony, and the Dallas Symphony had purchased one of the most beautiful sets of large church bells that had been tuned to the low C and the G. And I don't know how much pleading went on. I don't know if it was a rental, but in these huge cases, wooden cases, these large, beautiful church bells arrived, and you struck them with a very large mallet. And I must tell you, that's the most beautiful sound I've ever heard for the Berlioz Symphonie Fantastique. And we recorded that too, I believe. I don't want to say it wrong. But we couldn't have made a better sound. So you see, one of the responsibilities is to find the perfect sound on any extra instrument that has to be brought in to provide the sounds that the conductor wants and that the music demands. It just doesn't happen. The other thing were players. We had to have the player that could play any extra part as well as any symphony player could play it. Well, Atlanta at that time didn't have an excess of excellent symphonic performers. I was training orchestrally my percussion majors, and it was a thin line to walk, but I was able to bring in my very best percussion performers. Some of them were some of the best tambourine players. There's a specific one, by the way, that played tambourine better than any of us could in the section. So when we had a piece of music like a Carmen, let's say, that required fantastic tambourine technique, we'd try and get that particular person in for that. And on it went, for whatever the requirements might be. As a statement, I would have to try and find the very best player, and then I would have to convince the personnel manager that we actually needed those extra players. So I want to shift ahead for a second to, I don't know if I want to mix them or not. I'm going to hold that for a minute. I want to put that in the part that's one of my most proud moments, one of the most special moments. But there's that statement. I think we're reaching the part where it starts to conclude with the symphony, because when I worked in the symphony, as I was starting to say, if you think it was 32 years of performing glorious music, it was the most wonderful experience you could have in your life. And it was also playing with 100-voice choirs. And I was fortunate enough to be sitting on the stage right by those choirs performing. The summary of performing with the symphony was such that you spend, I truly believe, after all those years, as much time off stage marking the music for all the performers, going to the library, working out the instrumentation for the next 6 weeks ahead, working with the stage crew to have all the instruments in place and everything set up on stage for every single rehearsal, and then playing your parts to perfection. That's more the total picture for whatever people might think the picture is. I hope I haven't forgotten anything extremely important, but I think that gives you quite a good overview. And I think I'll move on to some of the places that might have been forgotten about the educator part of the questions. As I stated, when I started at Georgia State University in 1968, there was this very limited amount of equipment. But more important was my limited ability to fulfill a percussion contract at the university. So when I was performing with the symphony, I was worried every day that I'd lose my job not being able to perform all of those tasks properly. When I was teaching at the university, I was worried every day that I wouldn't keep a full house of percussion majors so that I could keep my job. I was even more worried when Shaw would take the orchestra out for a month's tour, and he would. We would travel all bus tours all through the Midwest, right in the middle of the year. Can you imagine? I was also amazed over my entire career that I never had an administrator or head of the music department that questioned that. They always worked with me. So I give my my bow to the people that were always in the music part of education and performance, that were able to work together and coordinate efforts for all of those that were trying to keep our professional careers together. It was really a great coordination. So I was scared about that. And when I was 23-year-old, as I said, the only way I knew that I could separate myself from the college students was to grow a huge brown beard. So I did. And if you see me in the early days, I had this enormous brown beard. I thought it would make me look a little older and a little more separated from the college students. I had a lot of trumpet in my background, and I studied extra trumpet with a wonderful player. So a couple of years I was teaching the brass methods course at Georgia State. I would never tell anybody in the symphony that I did that. It was only because I was doing it in the confines of Georgia State. I had taken an extra summer of study at Georgia State with a wonderful teacher named William Hill, who was head of the brass department. And I had taken meticulous notes of everything he had said in his presentation for the brass methods class that summer. And then I had it all summarized. And so I was able to have enough chops to perform on the trumpet. And then I had his notes that covered every aspect of teaching a brass methods class. It went very well. I wouldn't do it again ever as time went on. But to cover their need at that moment, I was able to do it just as I was in theory or history. And then I had to move more and more into the background as my percussion grew. So how did the percussion grow? I was kidded by so many people saying, Jack Bell went out into the streets of Georgia State University down by the Capitol, and he said, hey man, would you like to learn how to play percussion, drum set? And that's the way I'd bring percussion majors in. Some way, I'm not so sure that it was that far away, but in reality, I had built a private studio at Georgia State in my own teaching studio of 20 private students. I had 20 private students in my 5th year at Oberlin, and I carried that concept through my entire teaching career up until the year 2000. So I pulled, they were 10th grade through 12th grade. I tried to limit it to that area, and I did. I had 20 private students, 10th grade through 12th grade. That was my feeder system, and I chose students that had the most potential to become percussion majors. So using that feeder system and involving them in the university every way I possibly could, I started building the percussion division from that point. The other way, of course, was my own reputation. Take a very short drink of water. With my own reputation, the percussion ensemble that had started publicly performing, and we did very good concerts in the performance hall. It was a small performance hall, but it still had enough people coming that it was being recognized as one of the more profound performing ensembles of the music school. So that was a 3-part prong to approaching it. And then I was making phone calls to every potential applicant, returning every phone call that came in, spending as much time talking to parents as I possibly could to try and grow the department. And any one of you that is a wonderful educator out there knows that it's not just teaching. You know that you have to roll your sleeves up and do the behind the scenes work in education at least as much as I had to do in symphony. So I was working on writing curriculums. I was teaching methods courses. I was teaching history courses. I was teaching the percussion majors, and it was an enormous amount of paperwork at the university. It was an enormous amount of recruiting so that I could have that wonderful privilege and pleasure to go and teach my percussion majors. That was the real pleasure of it all, but you had to earn that responsibility. You had to earn that right to have that responsibility come about. So it grew. I'm so happy to say that it grew. Little by little, the one percussion major became 2 or 3. The 2 or 3 started working together, and they would tell their friends, their percussion friends. I actually grew to about 6 percussion majors. 6 percussion majors, ironically, is enough to keep a half-time contract alive as long as I was doing percussion methods, percussion ensemble, and teaching something significant like one of the other major courses, history, brass, whatever it might be. But here's the thing that happened at Georgia State that I'll be forever grateful and proud of. As the percussion division started to grow and I was reaching that point that the administration would admit that I had enough students to carry my load, we were, say, at 8 students. So the program had been in existence long enough that some of my first undergraduate students had graduated and they were taking master's programs. When they completed their master's programs, I was pulling them back into the university to be my assistants. And a lot of times they had a specialty. Like one of my majors could be a better mallet player than I might have been. That wouldn't have been uncommon because they would go out to the PAS clinics, as an example, and they would learn from the masters on that instrument. I had some very fortunate experience to advance myself on mallets, but it was all in school. I was tied between that 4-mile drive back and forth between Symphony Hall and Georgia State 2 or 3 times a day, and that was my life for 32 years. The only way I'd get all the new information was from all my young professionals going out and bringing it back into me. So that was my lifeline. They were bringing the information in. I was assigning a new major or 2 to them. That new performing was taking place in my division, and it was exciting everyone. So I caught on to the concept after about, believe me, 20 years. It was about 1988 when I realized what was really starting to happen. At that time, I had invited, it was Mark Yoncich or Paul Yoncich, either one that was timpanist with the Atlanta Symphony, to begin teaching for me as an affiliate teacher. I grew my percussion division with my affiliate teachers, great performers. Bill Wilder, the second percussionist with the orchestra, wonderful drum set player, especially for big band chart reading. So he was my big band chart reading specialist. He might only have had 1 student, but it was the best experience that student could possibly get. Robbie Coleman had just graduated from Berklee, and he was bringing in the Berklee techniques, and students were just hoping to study all those jazz techniques with him as though they were studying at Berklee. So I would filter out the students, even though the individual professionals only had 1 or 2 students to study. That was fine because as we grew, we got to 15, 16, 18, and by the time I had 18 percussion majors from that one lowly beginning in 1967, the head of the music department and the other professors that taught there were taking such notice of how my division had grown with our seminars that were taking place every week, the fantastic performances that were happening, and the general program, that I reached the point of closeout with a half-time position. And so we had a waiting list of people to come in because the university said they really couldn't afford to pay more affiliates to just teach that position of mine. So that was actually very exciting because a percussion department for a university with a music department the size of Georgia State had 18 or so percussionists to provide everything that the ensembles would need. Now the school was growing, music industry, jazz department, the music education area, they were all growing. And we started to be reaching the point that we could move to the Rialto Theater. The Rialto Theater was the ultimate home for me. I had one of the largest teaching studios in the basement of the Rialto Theater, and I had a full house of percussionists. So when I reached my final concert at the university in the year 2000, having started in 1967, the performing majors or students represented every area. music industry, jazz performers, percussion performance majors. I wish I could think of all of them. I'm sorry, I can't think of it all right now. But we represented just about every facet of music, performing, education, and the music industry. It was 22 performers on stage. I'd taken over a full-time contract in the year 2000 for the last 2 years of my performing and teaching career. And I did a grand Caribbean concert that I had paid for a Caribbean group from Oberlin, my home university, to come down and perform on the stage of the Rialto Theater in full gala outfit, and including limbo contests and everything you can imagine. It was a wild party. And the Rialto housed 700 seats. It was filled to overflow, including standing room only. So I'm just trying to show that from one broken down instrument and one percussion major over a 35-year period. That's a long time, of course, but not in the perspective of when you're just looking at it in a bird's eye view. So that's that story. There are only a couple of other things here if I've usurped the day here.
I do just want to say for a second that it's really cool, at least for me personally, to hear, knowing what you did over the years at Georgia State and the ASO, to know that it started out not that way, that you kind of had to build it from the ground up. It's good to hear, because I'm sure we're hopefully going to have a lot of young listeners and young watchers of this, and for them to just keep in mind that you may not start out with gold, but if you hang in there and you fight the good fight, you can come out with, like you said, that packed auditorium that you might not have ever been able to imagine when you were 23. So that's a very cool story to hear.
Oh, thank you very much. And you said that watching for opportunities along the way. Sitting in a couch in my home, I had a Carol Sound green catalog, and it had a picture of a steel band in it. So I grabbed it and started the first steel band in Georgia. It was called Bamboo Tamboo, a 6-piece steel band. The Atlanta Symphony wanted educational concerts, so we put together the Atlanta Percussion Trio. And the Atlanta Percussion Trio performed concerts all around the Atlanta area. I was familiar with MPTF concerts, the match funds, so we did match fund concerts for years. The recording industry went crazy for about 10 straight years, and that was before electronics came in to replace the hard playing musicians, and we were out there all the time. So I was able to do local, national, regional performances, and we carried instruments in, live instruments, of course, to do those recordings. It was like you watch for every little opportunity, and then you grab for them the second you see them and try to develop it. You said basically the last parts here. You said as part of the ASO for over 30 years that I've seen some great things. Can I share a couple of memories? These are just paragraphs, but I think they're pretty profound paragraphs. One of the most fulfilling moments for me as a teacher and a performer combined, because I've said I cannot separate those two. If you took either one away from me, I'd die. That's who I am. Was sitting on the stage in Symphony Hall when we were performing Respighi's Pines of Rome. I was playing the solo bell part, which only occurs in the first movement. There are many other movements. So I had a chance to sit on my chair and look down the stage at the other performers, and they were intense. It was so gratifying to see that. All of the other performers on stage were my percussion majors at Georgia State. And there were 5 of them. I don't want to quote that wrong, but it was all the players that it took to fill out the parts on the Pines of Rome. So I was watching. That's right. It was 5 of them. I see it. It was for Telarc, which is a major recording industry to produce records on Telarc. So if you ever see or hear of the Pines of Rome being recorded under Robert Shaw, and you are associated with the percussion industry here, or the percussion areas in Georgia, just know that that particular recording was all percussion majors at Georgia State performing those parts. Quite remarkable. For me personally, there was a moment. There may have been a couple of them. There's only one I remember right off. We were performing Rimsky-Korsakov's Scheherazade, and I was sitting behind snare drum, which I had to play so many times. When that performance ended, I actually was just sitting there. The whole orchestra was leaving, as it normally would leave in about 15 seconds. The stage would be empty, as you know. And I realized at that very moment, after 25 years of performing, I had a moment performing that I couldn't make a mistake, where I'd lived in fear of making a mistake most of my career. And so I sat there and enjoyed the moment. Snare drum was my main instrument, of course. I had all the confidence that I could have playing snare drum, whereas on xylophone, I lived my entire performing career in fear. But that's the truth, if you want to know. I hardly ever missed a note, but I over-prepared. I prepared after the performances were over. I lived the parts weeks in advance and weeks after. It was a real burden on me to have a major performance with a mallet part like that coming up. But that snare drum had that magic moment to it. There was another moment, though, which was playing Porgy and Bess. It was for Jimmy Carter's inauguration. And the orchestra divides up in some of the most crazy ways you could ever imagine. And in this particular way, the xylophone was not put behind the strings like it is sometimes, which I never quite understand, by the harp player. But I was forced out because of the stage limitations in Washington where we performed, to have the xylophone on the front leaf of the stage on the outside of the first violins, if you can picture that. So this was the inauguration for President Carter. It was being recorded by National Public Radio, and because of that inauguration, every diplomat and official and any great person that you could think of was sitting in the audience. Now, all I could think about at the moment was getting through Porgy and Bess the best I possibly could, and I had played it many times. So I was focused. I was ready for the first entrance of Porgy and Bess. The conductor, who was Robert Shaw, who was a very good friend of Jimmy Carter, gave the downbeat. We came up to my entrance. I played it probably as well as I'd ever played it. I hit that last note of the first entrance, and the entire auditorium started spinning around. The adrenaline shot me so hard. I grabbed hold of my stool behind me because I felt like I was going to faint. And I reeled back on the stool, knowing that I couldn't do anything that anybody would really notice. And I don't know how you think through those kind of moments. It's surreal. So I was holding onto the stool. I knew I only had about 3 or 4 measures to put myself completely back together. And there's no way to describe how you do that. You just do it. And I got up then, and I was able to turn the page, because you have to turn the page before the second entrance. And then I made the second entrance, and I played it shaking, but I made it fine. And then the bell part that comes up so easy and simple with those little octave bells, I actually play them in octaves. Right afterwards, it was almost harder to hit the notes with that until everything settled down. Now, the rest of the piece became quite a powerful performance, because if you've made it through the first 2 entrances of Porgy and Bess, you're going to play the rest of it right if you're concentrating. But just remember, somebody that's played professionally for years, when put in those kind of situations, or at least I'll say for me, can be overwhelmed with emotion right after the performance. So I had my stool to grab hold of to keep me on my feet in the hall. Just being honest with you. And there was one more thing. This was just purely emotional, just wonderful and emotional. The Atlanta Symphony and Chorus was invited to perform in East Berlin, right after the wall had come down. So we were in the concert hall, but before we entered, the entire audience had been there for a very long time. When we were about to enter the hall, the entire audience was taken out, and it was very voluntarily. So out of deep respect to the members of the orchestra, the entire audience waited outside of the concert hall. I don't know how to ever understand that or react to it, but that was their way of giving us their deepest respect. We went in the hall, and the hall was empty. So we were actually a little confused as to what had happened, because it was like time for the concert. So they explained it to us, the management explained it to us. And we warmed up, and we, of course, had not had a chance to warm up for a little while, so we did good warm up. We tuned, and then we were silent. So the audience came back in, and it was absolutely silent. You could hear a pin drop. And it stayed like that for a little while until Robert Shaw came out. Now, normally when the conductor comes out, you expect for the audience to clap. But it was, again, that show of respect, more than I've ever understood. So it was silent, and I guess everybody understood it. So he came out, and he conducted one of the most magnificent conductings of the Beethoven Ninth Symphony, especially the power that went into his chorus when we performed that finale. The second we finished the finale, the audience just exploded. That's the only way I think I could say it. And the explosion that they did was instantaneous. And it went on for more curtain calls for Robert Shaw than I've ever seen in the 20 years that I worked under him. I don't think there was a single one of us that wasn't filled with tears and emotion to know what had just taken place, because those people were under such oppression, and they had had this moment in their lives. You asked me about my book at Georgia State, Developing Rhythmic Sensitivity. It's like every other aspect of my life. When I started this project, all I did, as you might or might not expect, is I took the only things that I had available to me. I tore pages out of my percussion books. And all I could do was just assemble some cut-up rhythm pages. And I started my first rhythm classes. They were beginning, intermediate, and advanced percussion pages. The class actually went very well because I didn't have any reference point for it to be bad, so everybody thought it was okay. Little by little, over a period of time, the book began to develop in concept, and I actually taught the course for over 20 years at Georgia State. So during that development period, I taught it to many different students at many different levels. There was one particular student, it was a graduate student, and she was head of the supervisor of music for Fulton County. Now, she was also the wife of the second percussionist with the orchestra. That's kind of a passing statement. So she was taking my course, and she's probably one of the most organized, brilliant people I had known. When I was teaching my course, the course was silent, but when we had a little break in the class, she came up and she said, "Jack, would you let me help you with your book materials?" And I want to say something about that right now. I think it's in here right next, just at the end. I never, ever would turn down any help from any student, graduate or undergraduate, because that is how I grew as a teacher and a performer. Those relationships that I had with my students and with my teachers filled in every blank place that I had in my own teaching. Who is to say that you're so good that you don't need help from everyone that you can get it? I don't understand that, why people turn that kind of help away. That's how you grow great relationships and partnerships with your students. The graduate students especially offered me so much helpful advice. So she took my course outline And all of a sudden, after a couple of weeks, these charts started showing back up. And these charts were putting my concepts into little boxes and attaching the boxes to other boxes. And all of a sudden, I saw my course. I saw what it was supposed to look like. And I was able to fly from there. But she put it in a state of organization that I just couldn't see. I could teach it. I had all the rhythms going, but I couldn't organize the concrete materials. And you know, you need help with that kind of thing sometimes. Somebody will have a superior mind to do an area that you're just not seeing. So please do that. You'll bond. It'll help your life become better as a teacher. The last thing you asked me was about COVID and how it's affecting all of our lives. You asked me to say something positive about it. So one of the first things that comes to my mind about a positive aspect of COVID is for people to redefine themselves. This is what has to happen if you're going to survive a major change. You're going down, you make a right turn, you don't expect it. You got to make the right turn. And then you got to proceed and accept it. So that's the first thing I think has to happen if people are willing to accept and face these major changes in our life. We have to be willing to make sudden right and left turns. When I saw what was happening, I immediately began to adjust my life as I have so many, many times before, without any hesitation. I was kidded so many times by members of my section and members of the orchestra saying, "Oh, Jack just lives in his own world. He wouldn't even know if a war came or went." Well, that's pretty harsh, but in the orchestra sometimes the comments can come down as a truth, but they hit you pretty hard when you think about it. So, not to be too hard on myself at that moment, what happened right here in the studio is that, and I have to say it now, this fantastic man that's sitting here beside me, Tom Pennington, he saw an opportunity for me to rebuild my studio basically from the ground up. So I had a teaching studio, but I didn't have a fantastic recording studio. I didn't have 5 monitors. I didn't have a studio that's surrounded with microphones everywhere. You can't see them right now on the video, but they're all over the ceiling of the studio. It's just, I'm encased with it. It's a beautiful home to come down to, leaving my own personal home. He's built a new world for me. And at this point in my life, what more could I ask for than to have something like this to continue with my life's ambitions? He's seen all that, and he's in the middle right now of helping me develop all that. He's also my recording technician, so he's helping me do my recording. And there's just no other person like him on the face of the earth that can bring about this part of my life. So what am I saying? You need to align with someone that has abilities above your own. All my life, I tried to surround myself with people that are smarter than I am, that had more abilities than I did. And I tried to shoulder up with those people because I knew it was the only way that I could advance. I have my own special set of abilities and possibilities, but if I didn't have help from those that I recognized immediately when I met them everywhere, that they had those special talents that would let things grow, that are the special things that become an improvement of what could be done for what we're trying to accomplish together, then you'd be living isolated. And we're so isolated by what's happening to us that if you don't reach out and ask for that kind of help, if you can't recognize that kind of help in those people, then you're forcing that kind of isolation on yourself. It's an emotional reaction, a gut-type knee-jerk reaction. And you just can't do that. It's at this very moment that you see this kind of thing starting to happen that you've got to free yourself and start looking for the next level of how you can become your new person. And you become your new person. It's like you just make it happen as the best you can within the environment that you're living. I know that musical performances, for an example, because my wife wants to be part of this, are happening where choirs are assembling across the whole United States. But it's a singer in California, it's a singer in New Jersey, it's a group in Minneapolis, and they're all performing at the same time under a single conductor. And these glorious choirs come together and they're performing. So people are acting as one mind spread across the entire nation. How could that have come about if it wasn't for COVID? I suppose those experiments were certainly taking place before COVID, but COVID emphasizes that and it brings it to the front of our mind. And it makes us start thinking that way. It's happening with instrumental groups. I think there was a reference here to concerts and college tours and groups. I've been sent performances by percussionists that have put together these wonderful percussion ensemble performances where each player is playing in a different place, and they've put these performances together. I'm not sure that that would have happened. So everywhere I look, I see that something new is evolving, be it a new product or a new concept or a new thought that's being created for what is now our new generation. And I guess that's where I conclude today.
Very cool. Thank you so much for sharing a lot of that stuff. I've enjoyed in every interview that I've conducted so far, there's always at least one really good nugget of either information or inspiration. And I think for yours, I mentioned earlier, the idea of you may not start out with everything you want, but you can build it with hard work, to what you said there at the end, where no matter how good you are at something, align yourself with people who might be good at something else or better than you. And that, I think that's a powerful lesson for any of us who, if you've done something for a long time and you think, I'm pretty good at this, you can always find somebody who can help you, maybe somebody who's on the next step of that journey. So just everything you said, you've had some amazing stories. I don't think that we'll ever be able to have experiences like playing for the Berlin Wall being torn down, playing for just all these crazy events. So it's really cool to hear these stories and the inspiration. And I do this wasn't on our rundown, but if there's anything else that you wanted to say, any kind of closing remarks to Georgia percussionists, anything, this is your moment to say anything else you want.
Well, I guess the one thing that was coming through my mind as you were making those statements is I did have the opportunity to play under some very famous composers and conductors. And you mentioned this at the very beginning. I can't run a list through my mind, but I could say that in both the Pops concert world, because the symphony acted like a big band during the summer season for so long, and we worked under these fantastic composers, like people like Henry Mancini. You know that name, I imagine. And then in the winter season, we had these phenomenal opportunities. We worked through one of the relatives of Gustav Mahler, and he conducted one of the symphonies that was his father's, I think, symphony, or an uncle. I can't remember the exact tie-ins. We worked with the conductor of the Boston Pops, who was a famous conductor. I'm going to be dry on thinking of it right now, and I never should be. But to work under the conductors from, say, the Boston Symphony or the Detroit Symphony, to work under a famous conductor from the Cleveland Orchestra, or to work under a profound conductor that's known internationally as a composer, like Aaron Copland, like I think you mentioned at the beginning of the interview. We've had those experiences, and those are names that'll last for as long as music is going to be in existence. To know that you can bring about the image of that person. There was one that was tender to me, and that was John Denver. He's a well-known Pops singer. You are familiar, I assume? Everyone is. So I had this chance when we were doing Pops concerts. I was standing backstage, and John Denver was there. I was about 3 feet away from him, and I saw in Chastain Park, I saw this enormous amount of makeup that he was having to put on to be under those extremely bright stage lights. But the point was, that was just an observation. It was being that close to an internationally known performer, and then going right back to my position on stage and playing my parts that was supporting as a singer. And then it was finding out later that he had died in a plane crash. I never forget that, you know? It's just so, it's so personal when those kind of things happen. And there's so many stories like that. I guess that's where we'll conclude.
Excellent. Well, thank you again for taking this time to talk to us. For anyone watching right now, we do have a really, really awesome educational video for Mr. Bell that we'll be posting soon as well. We're going to have, of course, more of these interviews, so please do make sure that you're following our Georgia Percussion or Georgia Chapter Percussive Art Society Facebook page and any of our other social media to keep up with that. And in the meantime, keep practicing, stay safe, and we'll see you all again soon.
Very good. Thank you.